The transport ship descended through the purple atmosphere of Training Station 17, carrying its precious cargo of young cadets from across the Galactic Coalition. Inside the passenger bay, 23 beings from 12 different species sat in nervous silence, their various appendages clutching containing their assignment details. They were the best and selected from millions of applicants to attend the most prestigious military academy in known space. Adjusted his breathing apparatus with one of his 4 arms, his compound eyes scanning the information again. From the ocean world of Depth's Edge, he had scored in the top percentile of his planet's entrance exams. Around him sat others equally accomplished. There was Mora, a towering whose crystalline skin refracted the cabin lights into rainbow patterns. Beside her, 3 triplets communicated in their species' clicking language, their fur rippling with excitement. The assignment was clear. They would spend 6 standard months learning advanced tactical operations, strategic planning, and combat coordination. Their instructor's name was listed simply as Instructor Human Terran Origin. None of them had ever met a human before. Earth had only joined the Coalition 15 standard years ago, and humans were still considered newcomers, their military contributions modest at best. "I researched humans," Mora announced, her voice resonating like chimes. "They come from a death world, high gravity, dangerous predators, and extreme weather variations." Translator implant processed her words. Death worlds were rare, planets so hostile that spacefaring species rarely evolved there. The Galactic Coalition had only 47 such worlds in the entire explored galaxy. Species from death worlds were always interesting, though typically they struggled with the refined nature of modern warfare. "Death often have strong physical capabilities," one of the triplets added. "But that means little in modern combat. Warfare is about precision, calculation, and restraint. It has been this way for 3,000 years. The ship touched down with barely a tremor, a testament to galactic engineering. The cadets gathered their belongings and filed out into the station's receiving bay. Training Station 17 was a massive orbital platform capable of housing 10,000 personnel and containing dozens of simulation environments. It orbited a lifeless brown dwarf, chosen specifically because there was nothing nearby to damage during live fire exercises. A protocol droid greeted them, its metallic voice pleasant and efficient. "Welcome, cadets. Please proceed to Briefing Hall 7. Your instructor will meet you there. Your quarters have been assigned and your personal items will be delivered shortly." The briefing hall was a circular room with tiered seating descending toward a central platform. The cadets filed in, naturally clustering by species, a common habit among Coalition military personnel. Found himself sitting between Mora and a named, whose 6 legs folded beneath him in the seat designed to accommodate various body types. They waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Murmurs began spreading through the assembled cadets. Punctuality was considered sacred in Coalition military culture. An instructor being late to a first meeting was unheard of. At precisely 12 minutes past the scheduled time, a door opened at the platform level. A figure walked in, and every cadet fell silent. The human was smaller than had expected. Most of the cadets towered over the instructor, who stood perhaps 1.7 meters tall. She wore a simple uniform, dark gray with minimal insignia, and her black hair was pulled back in a practical style. Her skin was brown, her eyes dark and observant. She carried nothing, no weapon, no teaching aids. She walked to the center of the platform and stood there looking up at them. The silence stretched. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Still she said nothing, just watched them with those dark eyes. Finally, curiosity overcame his patience. "Instructor." She smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "You're wondering why I was late." It wasn't a question, but several cadets nodded. "I was watching you," said, her voice carrying easily through the hall despite not being particularly loud. "Watching how you arranged yourselves, species clusters, comfortable, predictable, exactly what I expected." She began walking slowly around the platform's perimeter. "You've all read the same tactical manuals, studied the same historical battles, learned the same approved strategies, the Battle of Crimson Nebula, the Siege of Fortress Quinn, the defense of the trade routes, beautiful, clean victories, minimal casualties, conflicts resolved through superior positioning and calculated force application." Stopped walking and looked up at them again. "Those manuals have been refined over 3,000 years of Coalition warfare. They represent the collected wisdom of hundreds of species and millions of military minds. They are perfect examples of civilized combat. She paused, and that unsettling smile returned. They will get you killed. The statement hung in the air like a physical thing. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. Mora's crystalline skin flickered with patterns that indicated confusion. "I don't understand," said his translator, giving his words a buzzing quality. "Those strategies have been proven effective across countless engagements. The coalition has maintained peace and order For how long?" interrupted. "How long since the coalition faced a real war?" "The conflict was only 40 standard years ago," one of the triplets responded. 17 battles across 9 systems, coalition victory with acceptable losses. Nodded, acceptable losses. The conflict lasted 3 years and resulted in approximately 42,000 casualties across both sides. Tragic, certainly. But let me give you some context from human history. She held up one finger. One battle, the Somme. Human year 1916, before we had even achieved flight beyond our atmosphere. 2 sides, roughly equal in technology and capability, fighting over a stretch of land about 40 kilometers wide. The battle lasted 4.5 months. She paused. Over 1 million casualties. The number was so large that several cadets' translators seemed to glitch, requesting confirmation. Mora's skin went completely clear with shock. "That's impossible," said. "No military engagement could sustain such losses. The economic impact alone would require both sides to mobilize their entire populations for total war," finished. Which is exactly what happened. Earth's First World War lasted 4 years and involved over 70 nations. 65 million people were mobilized for combat. 20 million died. She let that sink in before continuing. "That was not our largest war. That dubious honor goes to the Second World War, which started just 21 years later. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died. That's roughly equivalent to the entire current population of the Coalition's core worlds." Felt his breathing apparatus working harder. His entire history of recorded warfare had resulted in perhaps 3 million deaths across 10,000 years. The scale described was incomprehensible. "Humans were killing each other with these numbers before joining the coalition?" Mora asked quietly. "Humans were killing each other with these numbers before we developed computers," corrected. "Before we had spacecraft, before we had energy weapons, before we had artificial intelligence. We did most of it with chemical propellants and sharp pieces of metal." She walked to the center of the platform again. "So when I tell you that your tactical manuals will get you killed, I'm not speaking theoretically. I'm speaking from the perspective of a species that refined warfare to a degree your civilization has never experienced and hopefully never will. We didn't stop wars because we got better at strategy. We stopped wars because we got so devastatingly good at killing that we finally scared ourselves into peace." One of the triplets raised a paw hesitantly. "But surely modern coalition warfare is more sophisticated. We have shields, energy weapons, faster-than-light travel. The variables are completely different." "The technology changes," agreed. "The principles don't. Coalition warfare is sophisticated, yes. It's also predictable, restrained, and follows agreed-upon conventions. You fight like chess players, careful, calculated, always thinking 3 moves ahead." She looked around at all of them. War is not chess. Real war, the kind that threatens species survival, is not a game with rules. It's chaos barely held in check. It's improvisation and desperation. It's doing whatever it takes to make the enemy stop. Spoke up, his voice uncertain. "The coalition has conventions for a reason. Rules of engagement prevent unnecessary suffering. Targeting civilian populations is prohibited. Chemical and biological weapons are banned. We fight with honor." "Honor is a luxury," said flatly. "A beautiful luxury that exists only when both sides agree to it. The moment you face an enemy who doesn't care about your rules, all that civilization vanishes, and it vanishes fast." Found his voice. "With respect, instructor, humans have been in the coalition for 15 years. You've participated in joint operations. Your performance has been adequate but not exceptional. If human warfare is so much more effective, why haven't you dominated coalition military rankings?" Smile returned, and this time it reached her eyes. "That's an excellent question, Cadet, and the answer is simple. We've been holding back." She pulled out a small device from her pocket and tapped it. The lights in the briefing hall dimmed, and a holographic display materialized above the platform. It showed a star system didn't recognize. This was a training exercise conducted 3 years ago, explained. A coalition fleet of 20 ships was tasked with defending this system against a simulated enemy force. The defending fleet was commanded by Admiral, with 40 years of experience and a flawless service record. The attacking force consisted of 3 human vessels commanded by a captain who had been in the coalition military for less than 2 years. The hologram began playing the engagement. Watched as the coalition fleet arranged itself in a standard defensive formation, positioning ships to cover likely approach vectors while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook perfect, exactly what any tactical manual would recommend. The 3 human ships approached from an unexpected angle, moving faster than anticipated. But instead of engaging, they broke formation and scattered, each heading in a different direction. "They're running," observed. "That's a retreat." "Keep watching," said. The coalition fleet adjusted, splitting to pursue. That was when things went wrong. One of the human ships, seemingly damaged and venting atmosphere, drifted into the range of 4 coalition vessels. They moved to capture it. The ship exploded. "Suicide attack?" Mora asked, horrified. "Drone ship," corrected. "No crew, packed with explosives and set to detonate when surrounded. Destroyed 2 coalition vessels outright and severely damaged the other 2. The hologram continued. The remaining coalition ships regrouped, but now they were disorganized, unsure where the other 2 human vessels had gone. They didn't have to wait long. Both ships emerged simultaneously from behind a planet's moon, having used its gravity well to slingshot themselves at devastating speed directly toward the defending fleet's new position. "They'll be destroyed in that approach," one of the triplets said. "Too much velocity to maneuver." But the human ships didn't try to maneuver. They fired every weapon they had in a continuous barrage while maintaining their collision course. Coalition shields absorbed most of the fire, but the sheer unexpectedness of the attack caused confusion. Ships broke formation to avoid collision. In the chaos, one of the human vessels clipped a coalition cruiser hard enough to send it spinning into another friendly ship. Both human ships were destroyed in the attack, but the coalition fleet was now scattered and damaged. The simulation ended with a victory for the attackers, despite losing all their ships. "Acceptable tactics according to human standards," said as the hologram faded. "Completely unacceptable according to coalition standards." Admiral filed a formal complaint about the exercise, stating that the human tactics were reckless, dishonorable, and violated the spirit of military conduct. "Because they were," said. "Sacrificing your own forces like that is wasteful. There's no honor in." "In winning," interrupted. "The objective was to prevent the fleet from defending the system. The humans succeeded. Yes, they lost all their ships. But in a real battle, those 3 ships could have been obsolete vessels with skeleton crews or even automated drones. The defending fleet lost 6 vessels and had the rest too damaged to protect the system. The planet would have fallen." She deactivated the hologram. "This is what I mean when I say your manuals will get you killed. You're all thinking about honor, about acceptable losses, about proper conduct. The humans in that simulation were thinking about winning at any cost. And in real war, the side willing to pay the higher price usually wins." The briefing hall was silent now, the earlier confidence of the cadets thoroughly shaken. Felt something unfamiliar in his chest, a tightness that his species associated with fear. Seemed to sense the mood. "I'm not here to make you into humans. Your species have different values, different cultures, different ways of thinking, and that's good. The coalition needs that diversity." She walked slowly around the platform again. "But I am here to teach you how to survive when you face an enemy who doesn't play by the rules. Because sooner or later you will face that enemy. The galaxy is vast, and we've only explored a fraction of it. Out there somewhere is a species that doesn't care about your conventions or your honor or your rules of engagement. And when you meet them, I want you to come home alive." She stopped and looked up at them again. "So here's how this is going to work. For the next 6 months, you're going to forget everything you learned about proper military conduct. You're going to learn how to fight dirty, how to improvise, how to turn every resource, every environment, every situation into a weapon. You're going to learn to think like the enemy, to anticipate the unthinkable, to do whatever it takes." Mora raised a hand hesitantly. "And then what? We just abandon coalition principles." "No," said firmly. "Then you remember them, you hold on to them, you fight to preserve them. But you do it with your eyes open, understanding that the enemy might not share those principles. You become warriors who can fight like devils but choose to fight with honor. That choice, that restraint in the face of capability, that's what makes you truly civilized. She smiled again, and this time it was genuinely warm. Your first exercise begins tomorrow at 600 station time. Get some rest. You're going to need it. The cadets filed out slowly, speaking in hushed tones. Walked beside Mora, both of them processing what they'd heard. "I've never heard of training like this," Mora said, her voice low. "Neither have I," admitted. "But I think I understand why they assigned a human to teach it. No other species in the Coalition has the experience." "It frightens me," Mora confessed. "The idea that we might need this knowledge." Nodded, his breathing apparatus cycling thoughtfully. "It frightens me too, but perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we should be frightened." They reached their assigned quarters, automated doors sliding open to reveal comfortable but Spartan rooms. Entered his and sat on the bunk, designed to accommodate his aquatic species needs. Through the viewport, he could see the brown dwarf the station orbited, its dim light barely illuminating the darkness of space. He thought about Instructor's words, about the wars she'd described, about the millions who had died fighting with primitive weapons on a single planet. The Coalition encompassed hundreds of worlds, trillions of beings, if they ever faced a conflict on that scale with modern weapons. He activated his and began reviewing the training schedule. Tomorrow they would begin with asymmetric warfare principles. The day after, resource denial and scorched earth tactics. The schedule continued with topics that would have seemed absurd a few hours ago, but now felt uncomfortably necessary. Settled into his bunk and tried to sleep, but his mind kept the next morning arrived too quickly for most of the cadets. Had managed perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep before his chronometer chimed at 5:30. He prepared himself quickly, adjusting his breathing apparatus and donning the training uniform that had been delivered to his quarters. The fabric was different from standard Coalition issue, darker and more flexible, with reinforced sections at the joints. The training deck was located in Section 7 of the station, a massive space that could be reconfigured into virtually any environment. When arrived with the other cadets, they found themselves facing what appeared to be ruins of a small settlement. Broken buildings, debris-strewn streets, and the skeletal remains of vehicles created a landscape of devastation. Instructor stood at the entrance, checking something on a handheld device. She looked up as the last cadets arrived and nodded approvingly. "Good. Everyone's on time. That's the last predictable thing that will happen today." She gestured to the ruins behind her. "This is a recreation of a town on Earth called Stalingrad, specifically its appearance during a siege in human year 1942. The battle lasted 5 months. Nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians died fighting over this one city. By the end, people were killing each other for individual buildings, for single rooms, for piles of rubble." The cadets stared at the devastation. It looked nothing like the clean, organized battlefields they'd studied in their tactical courses. "Today's lesson is simple," continued. "Urban warfare. Fighting in cities is messy, chaotic, and deadly. Every window is a potential sniper position. Every doorway could hide explosives. Every pile of debris could conceal an enemy squad. The environment itself becomes a weapon." She pointed to the ruins. "You're going to split into 2 teams. One team defends, one team attacks. The objective is that building in the center." She indicated a partially collapsed structure that might have once been an administrative building. "Defenders, you have 30 minutes to prepare your positions. Attackers, you'll assault from the eastern approach." Raised one of his forelegs. "What weapons are we using?" "Training rifles set to simulation mode. They'll register hits without actually injuring anyone. Your suits will provide feedback when you're struck, ranging from mild discomfort to complete system shutdown depending on where you're hit and how severely." Smiled. "Trust me, you'll want to avoid getting shot. Now, team assignments." She divided them quickly and found himself on the attacking team along with Mora, 2 of the triplets, and 6 others from various species. The defending team, led by, hurried into the ruins to establish their positions. Handed each attacker a training rifle and a basic combat pack. "You have 30 minutes to plan your assault. I suggest you use it wisely." The attacking team gathered in a cluster, and immediately the arguments began. "Standard approach," one of the cadets, a named, insisted. "Three-pronged advance with covering fire, textbook urban assault." "That building provides excellent defensive advantage," Mora countered, her crystalline form shifting through anxious color patterns. A frontal assault will result in heavy casualties. Then we use suppression fire to keep them pinned while a flanking team circles around, suggested one of the twins. Listened to the debate, but his mind kept returning to yesterday's briefing, to instructor's words about improvisation and thinking beyond the manual. He looked at the ruins, really looked at them, trying to see them not as a battlefield, but as a problem to be solved through unconventional means. "What if we don't assault at all?" he said quietly. The others turned to him. "What do you mean?" asked. "The objective is to capture that building, correct? Not to eliminate the defenders. Said the environment becomes a weapon. What if we use it?" Mora's colors shifted to curious patterns. "Explain." Pointed to the ruins. "These buildings are already damaged, unstable. What if we make them more unstable? Collapse structures to block the defenders' sight lines, create choke points, force them to reposition into less advantageous locations." "That's not fighting," protested. "That's engineering." "War is engineering," one of the twins said thoughtfully. "The instructor said to think beyond conventional tactics. This qualifies." They had 20 minutes left. Working quickly, they formed a plan that would have horrified their previous instructors. Instead of a direct assault, they would systematically destabilize the surrounding structures, using their rifles' power packs to create small explosions that would bring down already weakened walls. The falling debris would not only block the defenders' sight lines, but also create safe approach routes through the rubble. Once voice came over their comm units announcing that preparation time was over, they moved into position. The first phase went smoothly, and two others fired their power packs at critical structural points on a building adjacent to the defenders' position. The explosions were small but effective. The building groaned and collapsed, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Shouts of confusion came from the defending team. They hadn't expected the battlefield itself to change. While they repositioned, the attacking team moved forward through the dust cloud, using the obscured visibility to close the distance. But was no fool. He'd spread his defenders across multiple positions, and as the attackers emerged from the dust, they ran straight into a crossfire. Three of his teammates registered fatal hits almost immediately, their suits locking up and forcing them to remain where they fell. "Fall back," Mora shouted, and the remaining attackers retreated behind cover. The casualties were lighter than a frontal assault would have caused, but their surprise advantage was gone. From her observation position outside the combat zone, his voice came over the general comm channel. "Interesting approach, attackers. Unconventional, but now what?" Crouched behind a section of broken wall, his breathing apparatus working hard as adrenaline pumped through his system. The training rifle felt heavy in his hands. They'd lost the element of surprise, and the defenders had excellent positions covering all obvious approach routes. One of the twins chittered urgently. "We need a new plan. Direct assault won't work now." "Could we collapse more buildings?" someone suggested. "They'll be ready for that now," Mora said. "They'll shoot our power packs before we can place them." Looked at the objective building again. It was partially collapsed, with the upper floors largely destroyed but the ground level still intact. Something about its structure nagged at him. What's beneath it? The others looked at him quizzically. "What do you mean?" Mora asked. "Urban buildings typically have basements, maintenance tunnels, sewage systems. Earth architecture especially, according to our briefings. If this is a recreation of an Earth city, there should be underground access." He checked the tactical map on his suit's display. Sure enough, there were subterranean passages marked, though they hadn't been included in the standard briefing. The Coalition way of warfare happened above ground, in clear sight, where honor and bravery could be displayed. Fighting underground was considered cowardly in most species' military traditions. "You want us to tunnel underneath them?" asked skeptically. "The objective is the building, not a glorious battle," pointed out. "If we can access it from below while they're watching the surface approaches." It went against everything they'd been taught, but that seemed to be the entire point of this exercise. Mora's colors shifted to determine patterns. "I'll go with you. My crystalline structure gives me excellent low-light vision, useful underground." They found an access point 2 buildings over, a collapsed section that revealed maintenance tunnels below. And Mora descended while the remaining attackers provided a distraction. firing at the defenders' positions to keep them focused on the surface battle. The tunnels were dark and cramped, filled with debris and the occasional structural support that groaned ominously. Aquatic species background made him claustrophobic in such confined spaces, but he pushed forward, using his suit's display to navigate by the tactical map. "This is insane," Mora whispered, her voice echoing in the tunnel. "If this place collapses, we'll be trapped." "War is insane," replied, surprising himself with how much he sounded like instructor. "That's what we're learning." They reached what should have been directly beneath the objective building. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of weapons fire as the surface battle continued. Examined the ceiling of the tunnel. It was already cracked and damaged, weakened by the building's partial collapse. "Help me find a way up," he told Mora. Together, they located a shaft that once might have been for utility access. It was partially blocked but climbable. Went first, his 4 arms proving advantageous for the vertical climb. Mora followed, her crystalline hands finding purchase on the rough surfaces. They emerged into the ground floor of the objective building, coming up behind the defenders' positions, and his team were focused outward, watching for the expected frontal assault. None of them noticed the 2 attackers rising from the floor behind them until Mora opened fire. The surprise was total. 4 defenders registered hits before they could react. Spun around, his 6 legs scrambling for cover, but Mora caught him with a center-mass shot that locked his suit's mobility functions. "Objective secured," announced over the comm channel, his heart's pounding with exhilaration and lingering fear. The simulation ended immediately. The training rifles powered down, and the suits released the fallen combatants. Stood up slowly, his expression difficult to read given his species' alien features, but his body language suggested frustration. Instructor walked into the ruins, her footsteps crunching on the simulated debris. She looked around at the fallen defenders, at the modified battlefield, at Mora standing in the objective building. "Well," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been approval. "That was unexpected." She addressed the entire group, defenders and attackers alike. "Attackers, tell me what you learned." Spoke first, that conventional approaches aren't always the best solution, that the objective matters more than how we achieve it. "That victory doesn't have to be honorable to be effective," Mora added quietly. Nodded, "Defenders, what did you learn?" His translator conveyed his irritation clearly. "That underground approaches are dishonorable but effective, that we should have secured all possible access points, not just the obvious ones. That expecting the enemy to fight fair is a good way to lose," another defender admitted. Walked to the center of the group. In coalition military doctrine, what Mora did would be considered questionable at best. Sneaking underground, avoiding direct confrontation, attacking from behind. But here's the thing, it worked. And more importantly, it minimized casualties. Only 3 attackers were lost in the initial advance, compared to what would have been total slaughter in a frontal assault. She pointed to the collapsed building they'd used as cover. "You used the environment creatively. You adapted when your first plan only partially succeeded. You achieved the objective with minimal losses. In human military history, we have a saying, 'All's fair in love and war.' It means that when survival is at stake, honor is secondary to effectiveness." Spoke up, his voice uncertain. "But if everyone fights that way without honor or restraint, war becomes monstrous." "Yes," agreed simply. "That's exactly what it becomes. That's why the Coalition's rules of engagement exist, why we have conventions and protocols. They're essential for preventing warfare from descending into total brutality." She paused, letting that sink in. "But you need to understand what you're restraining. You need to know how dark war can get, how ruthless and terrible, so that you appreciate the value of those restraints. And so that when you face an enemy who doesn't share your values, you're not helpless." She activated her handheld device. "Next scenario. Defenders and attackers switch roles. This time you're fighting over a supply depot in the Arctic. Extreme cold, limited visibility, equipment malfunctions. And I'm introducing a new element. Both teams get 3 civilian NPCs that you're responsible for protecting." The cadets groaned, but there was less resistance than before. Something had shifted in their understanding. Caught Mora's eye, and she flickered in what might have been her species' equivalent of a smile. The rest of the day continued in similar fashion. Scenario after scenario, each designed to push them beyond their comfortable tactical doctrines. In the Arctic Depot battle, Half the cadets learned the hard way that trying to fight while also protecting civilians created impossible tactical situations. Sometimes the only winning move was retreat, abandoning the objective to save lives. In a desert scenario, they learned about resource warfare when cut their water supply halfway through the exercise. Suddenly, the objective wasn't the enemy position but the water cache, and both sides became desperate. The fighting turned vicious in ways that shocked everyone involved. By the time the day's training ended, all 23 cadets were exhausted, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their minds reeling from scenarios that contradicted everything they'd learned before. Gathered them for a debrief in the observation deck overlooking the training area. "Today you learned that warfare is messy," she began. "That perfect tactics don't survive contact with reality, that sometimes the best choice is the one that feels wrong. How many of you felt guilty about the tactics you used today?" Nearly every hand went up. Even raised one of his arms, remembering the uncomfortable feeling of attacking from behind, of abandoning civilians to save the majority. "Good," said. "That guilt is important. It means you still have a moral compass. The danger isn't in knowing how to fight dirty. The danger is in enjoying it, in losing that discomfort with necessary evil." She looked at each of them in turn. "Humans learned this lesson the hard way through centuries of increasingly brutal warfare. We got so good at killing that we nearly destroyed ourselves. The guilt, the horror, the refusal to accept war as normal, that's what finally saved us." She pulled up a holographic display showing a blue-green planet. "Earth. Maya's seen enough war to last 1,000 lifetimes. We fought with sticks and stones, with swords and spears, with gunpowder and nuclear weapons. We've committed atrocities that still shame us generations later. We've lost millions to our own stupidity and pride." The image shifted to show peaceful cities, green landscapes, thriving populations. "But we learned. We grew. We joined the coalition not because we were looking for new enemies, but because we were desperately hoping to never need those war skills again. When we share our knowledge with you, it's not because we think the coalition should become more like humanity was. It's because we want to ensure that if the worst happens, if you face an enemy who forces you into that darkness, you'll survive to build something better afterward." Raised a hand. "How do we know when it's justified, when it's acceptable to abandon our principles for survival?" Was quiet for a long moment. "That's the hardest question in warfare, cadet, and I don't have a perfect answer. But I can tell you this, the fact that you're asking means you're thinking like a warrior instead of a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. Warriors make hard choices and live with the consequences." She dismissed them for the evening, and the cadets filed out slowly. Walked beside Mora again, both of them processing the day's experiences. "I didn't expect to feel this way," Mora admitted. "Victorious but ashamed, successful but guilty." "I think that's the point," said. "Wants us to understand what we're capable of while never forgetting why we shouldn't do it unless absolutely necessary." They reached the cafeteria and joined the other cadets for the evening meal. The conversations were different from the night before, less confident, more thoughtful. Several cadets were already questioning whether they wanted to continue the training. Understood the feeling. Today had shown him capabilities he didn't know he possessed and didn't particularly want. The ability to think tactically without honor, to prioritize objectives over dignity, to win at any cost. These were not skills his culture valued, but they were skills that might keep him alive, and more importantly, might keep those under his command alive if he ever rose to a leadership position. As he ate his meal, specially prepared for his species' dietary needs, he noticed Instructor sitting alone at a corner table. She looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. There was something heavy in her posture, a weight that was only beginning to understand. She caught him looking and raised her drink in a slight salute. Returned the gesture, a moment of understanding passing between them. Carried the burden of her species' violent history, and now she was passing that knowledge to a new generation, hoping they would never need to use it but ensuring they could if necessary. The third week of training brought a new kind of challenge. Instructor led the cadets to a different section of the station, one they hadn't accessed before. The corridors here were darker, the atmosphere heavier somehow. Warning signs in multiple languages marked the entrance. Live fire zone, actual weapons, real danger. "Today we discuss weaponry," announced as they entered a massive armory. Racks upon racks of weapons lined the walls, ranging from simple projectile firearms to exotic energy weapons and things couldn't even identify. "The Coalition has developed beautiful weapons. Elegant, Precise. Energy-based systems that disable rather than destroy. Ships equipped with shields that absorb damage before anyone actually gets hurt. It's all very civilized. She walked to one of the racks and pulled down a long metal object. It looked primitive compared to the sleek energy rifles the cadets trained with. This is an AK-47, human design, developed in the mid-20th century. It fires small pieces of metal at high velocity using chemical propulsion. No energy shields, no stun settings, no elegant containment fields, just a lump of lead that tears through flesh and bone. She held it up for them to see. This weapon is over 200 years old by human standards. It's obsolete, crude, and inefficient. It's also one of the most successful weapons designs in human history. Simple enough that anyone can learn to use it in an hour. Reliable enough that it works in any environment. Cheap enough to mass-produce by the millions. Do you know how many of these were manufactured? None of the cadets ventured a guess, smiled grimly. Conservative estimates put it at over 100 million. One weapon design, 100 million copies, and that's just one type of firearm. Humans created thousands of different weapon systems, each designed to kill more efficiently than the last. She set the rifle down and moved to another section. Coalition doctrine focuses on non-lethal resolution. Disable enemy shields, damage their engines, force them to surrender. It's based on the assumption that both sides value life and will surrender rather than face total destruction. That assumption works when fighting other coalition species. But what happens when you face an enemy that values victory more than survival? Mora's crystalline form shifted to troubled patterns. Surely most spacefaring civilizations would value preservation of life. To reach our level of development requires cooperation and requires ruthlessness, interrupted. At least it did for humanity. We didn't cooperate our way to space travel. We competed. We fought. We poured resources into weapons development because the alternative was being conquered by someone who did the same. The technology you use for peaceful space exploration, humans developed most of it trying to kill each other more effectively. She activated a holographic display. It showed technical schematics for various weapon systems. Your coalition energy weapons are optimized for efficiency and precision, maximum effect with minimum collateral damage. Excellent design philosophy for peacekeeping. But here's a human weapon concept we developed and then agreed never to use. The schematic showed something called a relativistic kinetic bombardment system. As explained it, felt his breathing apparatus struggle. The concept was simple and horrifying. Accelerate a dense object to a significant fraction of light speed and drop it on a planet. The kinetic energy would be equivalent to nuclear weapons, but with no radiation, no complex delivery system, just basic physics turned into a planet-killing weapon. We called them rods from God, said quietly. Never deployed them, thank every deity you can name, but we designed them. We calculated the specifications. We knew exactly how to crack a planet's crust if we ever needed to. That's what total war thinking produces, weapons so terrible that even the people who create them are horrified by their own ingenuity. Spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. Why are you showing us this? The Coalition would never allow such weapons. The Coalition is not the galaxy, replied. You're all thinking too small. The Coalition encompasses maybe 1% of the explored galaxy. 1%. The rest is unknown space, potentially filled with species who don't know about your rules and wouldn't care if they did. She changed the display to show exploration data. In the last 5 years, Coalition scout ships have made first contact with 17 new spacefaring civilizations. 16 of them were peaceful and joined the Coalition. One was aggressively expansionist and had to be contained through military action. The containment was successful because they were technologically inferior and agreed to ceasefire terms when faced with overwhelming force. But every year, the odds of encountering something truly dangerous increase. Found his voice. You think war is inevitable, that eventually the Coalition will face an enemy like humanity was, someone who won't play by the rules. I think war is always possible, corrected. And possibility requires preparation. Let me show you something else. She led them to another section of the armory, this one containing smaller, more personal items. She picked up what looked like a simple metal cylinder. Human combat knife. Basic tool. Edge for cutting, point for stabbing, handle for grip. Humans have been making these for over 10,000 years. We still make them today, even with all our advanced technology, because sometimes the simplest tools are the most reliable. She demonstrated the knife's balance, the way it could be thrown, the various grip styles for different combat situations. Coalition doctrine provides energy blades for close combat. Clean, efficient, instantly cauterizes wounds. Very humane. This knife does none of that. It's messy, painful, and terrifying, but it never runs out of power, never needs maintenance beyond sharpening, and works in any environment including total vacuum. One of the triplets raised a paw. Are you suggesting we should use primitive weapons instead of our advanced technology? I'm suggesting you should understand that technology can fail, said. Energy weapons need power cells, shields need generators, advanced systems need maintenance. When everything goes wrong, when your ship is damaged and your equipment is failing, you need to know how to fight with whatever is available. That might mean improvised weapons. It might mean hand-to-hand combat. It might mean using parts of your environment in ways they were never intended. She returned the knife to its place and faced the group. Tomorrow, we're doing a zero-equipment survival exercise. You'll be dropped into a hostile environment simulation with nothing but your basic uniforms. No weapons, no tools, no communication devices. You'll need to survive, locate objectives, and complete mission parameters using only what you can improvise. It's going to be unpleasant. The next day proved prediction accurate. The cadets found themselves transported to a simulation of a crashed ship on a hostile world. The environment was a nightmare. Toxic atmosphere requiring their suits' basic filtration, gravity slightly higher than comfortable, and aggressive native life forms that the simulation rendered as terrifyingly realistic predators. Quickly realized his aquatic heritage was a disadvantage here. The high gravity made movement exhausting, and his breathing apparatus had to work overtime to filter the toxic air. But he wasn't alone in struggling. Mora's crystalline structure made her heavy and slow. The triplets were built for forest environments, not rocky wastelands. Only a few species seemed comfortable, and even they were far from their optimal conditions. First priority, announced, taking charge of the scattered group. We need shelter and a defensible position. That cave system looks promising. They moved toward the caves, but one of the simulated predators attacked before they reached safety. It was massive, easily 3 meters long, with multiple limbs and more teeth than seemed necessary. The simulation's tactile feedback made the danger feel terrifyingly real. Without weapons, the cadets scattered. One of them, unnamed, grabbed a rock and threw it at the creature. The rock bounced off harmlessly. The predator lunged and registered as injured by the simulation, forced to limp dramatically by his suit's feedback systems. Circle it, Mora shouted. Her tactical training kicked in despite the fear. Multiple angles confuse its targeting. The cadets spread out and understood what needed to happen. Individually, they were prey. Together, they became dangerous. He grabbed another rock, heavier this time, and waited for the predator to focus on someone else. When it lunged at one of the triplets, threw with all 4 arms, aiming for what looked like sensory organs on the creature's head. His aim was good. The rock struck hard enough to make the predator recoil. Mora followed up, using her crystalline body to reflect sunlight directly into the creature's eyes, blinding it. Despite his species' generally peaceful nature, charged the disoriented predator and used his 6 legs to kick it repeatedly in what appeared to be its vulnerable underbelly. The simulated creature retreated, deciding easier prey existed elsewhere. The cadets regrouped, shaken but alive. His injury meant he couldn't run, so 2 others supported him as they completed the journey to the caves. Inside the rocky shelter, they took stock of their situation. No weapons, minimal supplies, and a mission objective that required them to reach a location 3 kilometers away across hostile terrain. The training exercise would last 48 hours, simulated at accelerated time to fit into one standard day. We need weapons, stated the obvious. Real ones, not thrown rocks. They spent the next hour improvising, helped fashion spears from broken rock formations and salvaged pieces of the crashed ship simulation. The metal was soft enough to shape with persistent effort, and they created crude blades that could be lashed to poles. It was exhausting, primitive work, but by the end they had a dozen rough weapons. Mora discovered that certain rock formations in the cave contained crystalline structures similar to her own physiology. She could resonate with them, creating sounds that the predators seemed to dislike. It wasn't a weapon exactly, but it gave them a way to deter attacks without direct confrontation. As they worked, instructor's voice came through their suit speakers, a rare direct communication during the exercise. Interesting problem-solving, cadets, but you're thinking too small. Look around. What else can you use? Looked around the cave, trying to see it through size. What would a human do? Humans who had fought wars with primitive weapons for most of their history. Then he saw it. The cave itself, he said aloud. We can use the terrain. Those predators are large. They'd have trouble navigating narrow passages if we can funnel them into confined spaces. Traps, understood immediately. We dig pits, create rockfalls, turn the environment into our weapon just like the urban combat exercise. They spent the next several simulated hours doing exactly that. Using their crude tools and their collective strength, they modified the terrain between the cave and their objective. A narrow pass got narrower, with rocks balanced above that could be triggered to fall on anything passing below. A depression in the ground became a pit trap, covered with local vegetation. They even created false trails that led to dead ends or dangerous terrain. When they finally moved toward their objective, they did so with confidence born from preparation. The predators that attacked found themselves facing not helpless prey, but a coordinated unit that used every advantage of terrain and tactics. The traps worked. The improvised weapons worked. Most importantly, the teamwork worked. They reached the objective, a beacon they needed to activate to signal their rescue, but had one final surprise waiting. As they approached the beacon, a new scenario element activated. A group of hostile humanoid figures appeared, armed with advanced weapons, standing between the cadets and their goal. New objective's voice announced. Hostile forces control your extraction point. You can retreat and wait for an alternative rescue which may not come, or you can engage despite being your choice. The cadets looked at each other. Retreat was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice their training manuals would recommend. But 48 simulated hours of struggle had changed something in them. They hadn't come this far to give up now. We attack, said, and he was surprised to hear agreement from the others. Even Mora, who had been advocating caution since the training began, had a determined set to her crystalline structure. They used everything they'd learned. Stealth approaches through difficult terrain, improvised weapons used in unexpected ways, diversionary tactics that split the enemy forces. Most importantly, they accepted that some of them would take hits, would register as casualties, but that the objective mattered more than individual survival. The battle was short and brutal. Half the cadets registered as wounded or eliminated, but they reached the beacon and activated it. Mission complete. The simulation ended, and they found themselves back in the training area, exhausted and covered in synthetic dirt. Instructor stood waiting, and for the first time since they'd met her, she was smiling broadly. Well done, she said simply. That's the first time in 3 years that a cadet group has completed that scenario without retreating. You learn to use everything available to adapt to circumstances, and most importantly, you learn to accept calculated losses for mission success. She walked among them, looking at each in turn. You're starting to think like warriors instead of soldiers. You're understanding that war isn't about following procedures. It's about solving deadly problems with insufficient resources and accepting the consequences of your choices. Spoke up his translator, conveying exhaustion. Everything hurts. My pride, my body, my preconceptions about warfare. Is this how humans always feel after battle? Smile faded. Yes, and it never gets easier. Every battle, every fight, every time you have to choose between bad options and worse ones, it takes something from you. The trick is to never let it take so much that you lose sight of why you're fighting in the first place. She dismissed them for the day, but asked and Mora to remain behind. When the others had left, she looked at them seriously. You two are showing particular aptitude for this training. That concerns me. Mora's colors shifted to confused patterns. Concerns you? We're doing well, aren't we? You're doing very well, agreed. Which means you're learning to think like predators. That's useful, even necessary, but I need to make sure you understand the cost. She gestured for them to sit, and she joined them on one of the equipment crates. Humanity has a concept called the 1,000-yard stare, continued. It's what happens to soldiers who've seen too much combat, who made too many hard choices. They survive, but something essential gets damaged. They come home but never fully leave the battlefield. She looked at them intently. I'm teaching you skills that could save your lives and the lives of those under your command, but I'm also teaching you skills that could break you if used too often or without proper psychological support. The Coalition doesn't have the same support structures that humanity developed because Coalition military forces haven't needed them. Your wars are clean, short, with manageable trauma. And real war isn't, said quietly. Real war is the worst thing sentient beings can inflict on each other, confirmed. It's necessary sometimes, justified sometimes, but never good, never clean, never something to celebrate or glorify. The moment you start enjoying this, the moment these skills feel natural rather than uncomfortable, that's when you need to stop and reassess. Mora's entire body flickered through rapid color changes, a sign of deep emotional processing. How do you manage it? How do you teach us these terrible things without being consumed by them? Was quiet for a moment. By remembering why. Every lesson I teach you, every dark tactic I share, I do it hoping you'll never need it, but preparing you in case you do. And by maintaining faith that species like yours, with your values and your commitment to civilization, will use this knowledge only as a last resort. She stood up. Get some rest. Tomorrow we're covering psychological warfare and morale manipulation. It's going to be deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, me included. But it's something you need to understand, because an enemy who knows these tactics will use them against you. As walked back to his quarters that evening, his entire body ached. The fourth month of training marked a turning point. The cadets had progressed through urban warfare, resource denial, improvised combat, and psychological operations. They'd learned tactics that would have seemed impossible on their first day, but they'd also lost something along the way. The easy camaraderie of the early weeks had been replaced by a harder, more serious demeanor. They understood now what they were training for, and it had sobered them all. Instructor noticed the change. During one morning briefing, she addressed it directly. You're starting to look like soldiers who've seen combat. That's appropriate. What you've learned in 4 months would normally take years of actual warfare to understand. But there's something missing from your education. She activated a holographic display showing a peaceful colony world. Cities, farmland, civilian populations going about their daily lives. War doesn't happen in a vacuum. It affects real people, destroys real lives, creates real consequences that last for generations. Today you're going to understand the other side of what you're learning. The cadets were transported to a simulation that was different from anything they'd experienced. Instead of controlling warriors, they found themselves assigned as civilian population managers during a war scenario, became the administrator of a hospital. Mora was assigned to refugee coordination. Others managed food distribution, infrastructure repair, and civilian evacuation planning. The simulation began with their city under attack. Not a clean military engagement, but a messy, terrifying assault that targeted civilian infrastructure. Power plants exploded. Water treatment facilities were destroyed. Communication networks collapsed. And suddenly the cadets weren't fighting anymore. They were trying to save people. The hospital filled rapidly with casualties. The medical simulation was brutally realistic. Civilians with injuries that his limited medical knowledge couldn't adequately treat. Children separated from families. Elderly beings who couldn't evacuate quickly enough. The decisions came fast and merciless. We need to evacuate the hospital, one of his assigned staff NPCs reported. But we have 200 patients who can't be moved safely. If we stay, the building might be hit in the next bombardment. If we evacuate, at least 50 patients will die in transit. Stared at the decision matrix on his screen, his breathing apparatus working hard despite no physical exertion. Every choice was terrible. Stay and risk everyone. Evacuate and guarantee some deaths. There was no good option, only varying degrees of tragedy. He made his choice. They evacuated, prioritizing the youngest and those with the best chance of survival. Exactly 43 simulated patients died because of his decision. The simulation made sure he saw each one, their designations changing from stable to deceased on his readout. Mora's experience was equally traumatic. Her refugee coordination role meant deciding which groups could access limited transport off-planet. Thousands of civilians, all desperate to escape. Transport capacity for maybe a third of them. Her species' empathetic nature made the simulation almost unbearable. Every family she couldn't help, every child she had to leave behind, registered as a personal failure. The simulation ran for 6 excruciating hours, compressed time making weeks pass in the scenario. By the end, their city was occupied by enemy forces. The cadets who had managed civilian populations watched helplessly as their decisions' consequences played out. The hospital had evacuated was indeed destroyed in a bombardment. Those 43 deaths had been necessary. But the building was targeted deliberately. a war crime by coalition standards, and knowing that didn't make the choice easier in retrospect. When the simulation ended, several cadets were visibly shaken. Two were crying, their species' emotional expressions of distress triggering empathy in the others. Instructor let them sit in that discomfort for a moment before speaking. "This is what you're really protecting," she said quietly. "Not territory, not resources, not abstract concepts like honor or sovereignty. You're protecting them. The civilians who never asked for war, who just want to live their lives in peace. Every tactical decision you make as a military leader has consequences for people like the ones you just tried to save." She walked among them, her expression showing rare vulnerability. Humans have a phrase, "War is hell." We say it so often it becomes meaningless, but it's true. War is hell for everyone involved, and civilians often suffer the most. When I teach you how to fight without restraint, when I show you humanity's most ruthless tactics, I need you to remember this day. Remember what those tactics actually do to real people. Spoke up, his voice unsteady. "How do you balance it? How do you use the terrible knowledge you've taught us while remembering what it does to civilians?" "You don't balance it," said bluntly. "You can't. That's the burden of command, the weight that every military leader carries. You do what's necessary to protect your people, and you live with the consequences. Some of those consequences will haunt you forever. That's not a flaw in the system. It's proof that you're still human, still moral, still capable of empathy." She pulled up another display, this one showing historical data from human conflicts. After our Second World War, the one I mentioned in our first meeting, humanity had to confront what we'd done. Cities leveled, civilian populations targeted deliberately, weapons so terrible they could end civilization. We saw the cost of total war, and it horrified us. That horror, that absolute rejection of what we'd become, is what finally pushed humanity toward lasting peace. Looked at the data, at the numbers that represented individual lives lost. You used the worst parts of human nature to finally achieve the best. You had to become monsters to learn how not to be. Yes, agreed. And we're still living with that guilt, still trying to atone for what we did to ourselves. When humanity joined the coalition, it wasn't just because we wanted allies. It was because we needed to be part of something better, something that could help us stay on the path we'd chosen. She changed the display to show coalition peacekeeping operations, humanitarian missions, successful conflict resolutions. This is what we're really fighting to preserve. The possibility of resolving disputes without total war. The chance for civilizations to grow and thrive without fear of annihilation. The hope that intelligence, cooperation, and compassion can triumph over destruction. Mora's colors had settled into subdued, thoughtful patterns. "But you're teaching us to be ready if that hope fails, to be prepared if we face an enemy who doesn't share those values." "Exactly," confirmed. "Hope for peace, prepare for war. It's an old human saying, but it's wisdom earned through terrible experience. The coalition has been lucky so far. 3,000 years of relatively contained conflicts. But luck runs out eventually, and when it does, I want you to be ready while still remembering why you're fighting in the first place." The afternoon session was different. Instead of combat scenarios, led them through case studies of famous humanitarian military operations. Coalition forces evacuating civilians from natural disasters, peacekeeping missions that prevented conflicts from escalating, medical ships providing aid to plague-stricken worlds. These were the successes, the times when military capability was used for pure good. "This is what most coalition military service looks like," explained. "Years or decades of peacekeeping, humanitarian work, and deterrence. Most of you will never see actual combat. Your careers will be spent protecting people, helping rebuild after disasters, and ensuring conflicts don't start in the first place. The skills I've taught you are insurance, not job requirements." Raised a hand. "Then why the intense focus on worst-case scenarios? Why spend months learning to fight like humans if we'll likely never need it?" Smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Because the one time you do need it, you'll need it desperately. And because knowing how to fight like this makes you better at preventing fights from starting. When you understand the true cost of war, when you've seen how dark it can get, you'll work harder to find peaceful solutions. You'll be more willing to compromise, more creative in problem-solving, more determined to avoid conflict." She pulled up a final display, this one showing training completion rates. "Of the 15 previous groups I've trained, 11 members went on to serve in diplomatic corps rather than combat roles. They took the knowledge of what war really means and used it to prevent wars instead. That's the outcome I hope for most of you." felt something shift in his understanding. This entire training program wasn't just about creating better warriors. It was about creating leaders who understood the full spectrum of conflict, from devastating warfare to complex peacekeeping, and who would choose the peaceful path whenever possible because they knew exactly what the alternative cost. The next week focused on strategy at a larger scale. Fleet movements, resource allocation, logistics chains. But even here, teaching remained grounded in harsh reality. She showed them how supply lines could be disrupted, how civilian populations could be used as leverage, how economic warfare could be as devastating as military strikes. Total war isn't just about destroying enemy forces, she explained during one session. It's about breaking their ability and will to fight. That means targeting industrial capacity, disrupting logistics, damaging morale. In human history, some of our most effective military campaigns never fired a shot. They were economic blockades that starved enemies into surrender. She displayed a case study from human history, the American Civil War's Anaconda Plan, a strategy that focused on economic strangulation rather than direct confrontation. It was effective but brutal, causing civilian suffering through shortage and deprivation. Coalition conventions prohibit this kind of warfare, observed. Deliberately causing civilian hardship is considered a war crime. By coalition standards, yes, agreed. But again, conventions only work when both sides agree to them. If you face an enemy willing to use economic warfare, you need to understand how it works, how to counter it, and if absolutely necessary, how to employ it yourselves. The discussion that followed was heated. Several cadets argued passionately that some tactics should never be used, regardless of circumstances. Others, including, took a more pragmatic view. The debate revealed deep philosophical divisions among the group. Let it play out before intervening. This disagreement is healthy. It means you're thinking critically about the ethics of warfare instead of just accepting doctrine. But here's the reality. You won't all agree on where the line should be drawn. Different species, different cultures, different values, that's fine. What matters is that you're consciously choosing your principles and preparing to defend them. She looked around at all of them. In 2 months, this training ends. You'll return to your home worlds and your assigned posts. Most of you will never see me again. But I want you to remember this. The goal isn't to make you comfortable with extreme tactics. It's to make you aware of them, prepared for them, and equipped to decide when, if ever, they're justified. That decision, that moral weight, is yours to carry. As the session ended, found himself in conversation with several other cadets. They'd formed close bonds through shared adversity, bonds that transcended species differences. Mora and others had become more than classmates. They were comrades who had seen each other struggle with impossible choices and emerge still committed to their values. "Do you think we'll ever actually use this knowledge?" Mora asked, her crystalline structure reflecting the station's lights in thoughtful patterns. "I hope not," admitted. "But I'm glad we have it, and I think is right that knowing this makes us better at preventing it from being necessary." Clicked his agreement. "I hated the first month of this training. Everything she taught us seemed to contradict our values, but now I understand. She's not teaching us to abandon our principles. She's teaching us to defend them from enemies who don't share them." They walked together to the observation deck, a favorite gathering spot during off hours. Through the massive viewport, they could see the brown dwarf the station orbited, its dim light painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said, gazing at the stellar body. "Hard to believe we've been training for war while surrounded by such peace." "That's the contradiction of military service," a voice said behind them. They turned to find instructor had followed them. "You prepare for the worst while hopping for the best. You train in peaceful surroundings to be ready for the most violent circumstances imaginable." She joined them at the viewport. "My grandfather fought in one of Earth's last major conflicts before we achieved global peace. He told me that the hardest part wasn't the combat. It was coming home afterward, trying to reconcile the violence he'd witnessed with the peaceful world he'd been fighting to preserve. He said he felt like two different people, the warrior and the civilian, and they never quite merged back together." "Did he regret his service?" Mora asked quietly. Shook her head. "No, he believed in what he was fighting for, but he carried the cost of it for the rest of his life. That's what I'm trying to prepare you for. Not just the tactical knowledge, but the psychological reality of being someone who knows how to do terrible things in service of good causes." Looked out at the stars, at the vast darkness punctuated by distant lights. Somewhere out there were civilizations they hadn't met yet. Some would be peaceful, seeking cooperation and mutual benefit. Others might be hostile, seeing the coalition as rivals or resources to exploit. The galaxy was larger and more diverse than any single species could fully comprehend. "We're not ready," he said quietly. "The coalition, I mean, we've been lucky for so long that we've forgotten how to be truly prepared." "You're more ready than you think," replied. "You have resources, technology, and most importantly, diversity. 1,000 species with different perspectives, different strategies, different strengths. That's an advantage no single species empire can match. You just needed someone to remind you that peace is a choice, not a permanent state, and choices can change." She turned to face them. "You're the future of coalition defense, not because you're the best warriors, though you're becoming quite competent, but because you understand both sides now. You know how to fight with honor and without it. You can choose restraint from a position of capability rather than weakness. That makes you dangerous to enemies and trustworthy to allies." The final month arrived with unexpected speed. Could hardly believe that nearly 6 months had passed since that first uncomfortable briefing. Looking around at his fellow cadets, he saw how much they'd changed. They moved differently now, with a confidence born from tested capabilities. But there was also a wariness in their eyes, a deeper understanding of what they'd learned and what it meant. Instructor gathered them for what she announced would be their final exercise. "Everything you've learned comes together here. This is a complete scenario, start to finish. Full-scale conflict simulation against an adaptive AI opponent that doesn't follow coalition conventions. No breaks, no do-overs, no mercy. You'll be split into command teams and given actual strategic decisions to make in real time. The simulation will run for 72 hours compressed into 3 days. When it's over, you'll understand what real command feels like." The cadets were divided into 3 groups, each assigned a different role in the conflict. Found himself as fleet commander for the defensive force, responsible for protecting a colony cluster of 5 inhabited worlds. Mora was assigned to his command staff as tactical advisor, headed the diplomatic corps, trying to negotiate while military forces maneuvered. Other cadets filled logistics, intelligence, civilian administration, and frontline combat roles. The scenario began simply enough. An unknown fleet entered coalition space, ignoring hails and demands to identify themselves. They positioned themselves near valuable trade routes and began interfering with commerce. Standard procedure would be to send a diplomatic mission while military forces established a defensive posture. His team immediately opened communications, offering to mediate whatever dispute had caused the incursion. The enemy AI responded with demands that were impossible to meet without abandoning coalition principles. They wanted exclusive control of the trade routes, immediate withdrawal of all coalition military presence from the sector, and tribute payments that would cripple the local economy. "They're not negotiating in good faith," Mora observed, her colors shifting through analytical patterns. "These demands are designed to be rejected. They want us to refuse so they can justify escalation." Agreed, he ordered his fleet into defensive formations around the colony worlds while maintaining non-aggressive postures. No coalition commander wanted to fire the first shot. It was both a moral principle and practical politics. Starting conflicts damaged careers and reputations. The enemy fleet seemed to understand this. They pushed closer, testing boundaries, looking for the precise point where coalition forces would finally respond with force. It was a game of chicken on an interstellar scale, and the enemy was better at it than expected. 3 hours into the simulation, the enemy made their move. They didn't attack military forces directly. Instead, they targeted an unmanned cargo vessel carrying medical supplies to one of the outer colonies. The ship was destroyed in seconds, its debris scattering across local space. His diplomatic team immediately filed a protest, demanding explanation and reparations. The enemy response was chilling in its simplicity. "Acceptable losses. The trade route is now closed." "They're daring us to escalate," said, his breathing apparatus cycling rapidly as stress increased. "Attacking an unmanned cargo ship is a violation, but not one that clearly justifies military response. If we attack, we're the aggressors. If we don't, they'll keep pushing." "We need to respond," one of his command staff argued. "Show them we won't tolerate violations." "But proportionally," another countered. "Limited response that matches the threat level." Made his decision. "We escort the next cargo convoy with military vessels. Make it clear we're protecting our shipping. If they attack, they'll be engaging coalition military forces directly, which justifies a stronger response. It seemed like a measured approach, exactly what coalition doctrine recommended. The enemy AI adapted immediately. Instead of attacking the escorted convoy, they hit civilian infrastructure on one of the outer colonies. Power generation facilities, water purification plants, communication arrays. Nothing that could be considered military targets, but everything necessary for modern civilization. The colony didn't have redundant systems for everything. Backup power covered emergency services but not residential areas. Water reserves would last maybe 2 weeks. Communication was down completely, meaning the colonists couldn't even call for help or coordinate their own emergency response. That's a war crime by coalition standards, Mora stated, her entire body flickering with distress. Deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure. But they'll claim it was military necessity, its diplomatic team reported. Those facilities could have military applications. The communication arrays definitely did. They're operating in a gray area of coalition law. Felt the weight of command crushing down on him. The colony needed help immediately. His fleet could provide temporary power generation and water purification using their ship systems, but that would pull vessels out of defensive positions. The enemy fleet was still there, still threatening, and now they demonstrated willingness to hit civilian targets. He ordered 2 ships to break formation and provide humanitarian aid. The moment they moved, the enemy fleet repositioned, filling the gap in the defensive perimeter. They didn't attack, just maneuvered into a more advantageous position. The message was clear. Every choice had a cost. The simulation continued with brutal realism. Over the next simulated weeks, the situation deteriorated. The enemy never quite crossed the line into obvious aggression that would justify full military response, but they kept pushing. More civilian infrastructure damaged, trade completely disrupted, colonies running low on essential supplies. The defensive fleet spread thin, trying to cover everything. His diplomatic team worked frantically, trying to find some compromise that would end the crisis. But the enemy kept moving the goalposts, adding new demands every time the coalition side seemed willing to consider their terms. It was exhausting, demoralizing, and entirely deliberate. They're not interested in diplomacy, finally admitted, his translator conveying complete frustration. They're using negotiations as another weapon, keeping us talking while they position for something bigger. Agreed. Intelligence reports provided by other cadets in those roles suggested the enemy was building up forces just outside the sector. Reinforcements arriving steadily, while coalition forces were tied down protecting civilian populations and maintaining defensive postures. "We need to act," told his command staff. "Waiting for them to make the first move means letting them choose the timing and location of the real battle. That gives them every advantage." But striking first violates coalition doctrine, Mora pointed out. It would be a preemptive attack without clear justification. The political fallout would be severe. This was the heart of the lesson, realized. Coalition doctrine worked beautifully against enemies who shared their values. But this enemy understood coalition restraint and was weaponizing it. Every principle the coalition held sacred became a chain limiting their options. He thought about everything instructor had taught them. About improvisation, about refusing to play by enemy rules, about doing what was necessary instead of what was proper. Then he thought about the civilian population simulation, about the faces of people whose lives depended on his decisions. "We're going to do something they won't expect," announced. "We're not going to strike first, but we're going to make it impossible for them to maintain their position." Mora, what did teach us about resource denial? Mora's colors shifted to comprehension. Make the prize not worth the cost. If they want the trade routes, we make the trade routes worthless to them. Over the next simulated days, fleet implemented a strategy that would have seemed unthinkable at the beginning of training. They began systematically dismantling the very trade infrastructure they were supposed to protect. Navigation beacons were powered down. Automated stations were evacuated and shut down. The trade routes became dark and difficult to navigate without coalition assistance. Simultaneously, they rerouted civilian traffic through alternate paths that were longer but safer. It was economically devastating in the short term, but it removed the enemy's leverage. They couldn't threaten trade routes that were no longer operational. The enemy AI adapted again. If the trade routes were worthless, they'd take the colonies themselves. Their fleet moved to attack positions, clearly preparing for full-scale assault. This time, there was no ambiguity. This was open aggression, finally giving the clear justification to respond with force. But the last 6 months had taught him that justification wasn't the same as capability. His fleet was in defensive positions, spread across 5 worlds. The enemy had concentrated their forces for a single overwhelming strike. In a straight fight, coalition losses would be catastrophic even if they won. "We can't win a conventional engagement," Mora said, her tactical analysis matching his own. "They have numerical superiority and better positioning." "Then we don't fight conventionally," replied. He pulled up tactical displays and began planning something that made his hearts race with a mixture of fear and determination. "Showed us that simulation from 3 years ago. 3 human ships defeated a larger force through unconventional tactics. We're going to do the same." His plan was complex and risky. Fake retreats to draw enemy forces into poor positions. Automated drone ships programmed to look like full vessels, drawing fire while real forces maneuvered. Use of the stellar environment itself as a weapon, luring enemies close to the brown dwarf where gravity would affect maneuvering. Most controversially, he planned to sacrifice 2 of his ships in suicide runs, piloted by AI with no crew aboard, to create chaos in enemy formations. It violated the spirit of honorable combat, even if technically no lives would be lost since the ships were automated. His command staff objected immediately. "That's too much like human tactics," one protested. "We're coalition forces, we fight with honor." "Honor doesn't matter if we lose and those colonies fall," countered. "The enemy isn't fighting with honor. They're fighting to win at any cost. If we limit ourselves to proper tactics while they don't, we're guaranteeing our own defeat." The debate consumed precious time, but understood it was necessary. This wasn't just about military strategy anymore. It was about identity, about what kind of military force the coalition wanted to be. Fight clean and maybe lose, or fight dirty and definitely survive. Mora finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Told us that real civilization is choosing restraint from a position of capability, not from weakness. If we can't win fighting honorably, then honor is just a pretty word for suicide. We choose to fight dishonorably so that our civilization can continue to exist, so that we can rebuild that honor afterward." The argument swayed enough of the command staff. They implemented its plan. The battle that followed was unlike anything coalition forces typically engaged in. Feints and deceptions, sacrificial units and environmental warfare, every trick and tactic had taught them deployed in rapid succession. The enemy AI was sophisticated, adapting to each new strategy, but the sheer unpredictability of the coalition approach kept it off balance. One of the suicide drone ships worked perfectly, slamming into an enemy capital vessel at high velocity and crippling it. The other was intercepted before impact, but its destruction created a debris field that disrupted enemy formations. Meanwhile, real coalition ships used the chaos to position for devastating strikes from unexpected angles. The fight was brutal and costly. Watched his fleet strength indicator drop steadily as ships registered damage or destruction. But the enemy was suffering worse. Their concentrated formation, which should have been their strength, became a liability when coalition forces turned it into a target-rich environment. 3 simulated hours of combat ended with the enemy fleet in full retreat. Forces had won, but at terrible cost. Nearly 40% of his fleet destroyed or critically damaged. If this had been a real battle with actual crews, thousands would have died. The simulation didn't end there. The aftermath proved almost as challenging as the battle. Colonies needed immediate humanitarian relief. Damaged ships required triage decisions about which could be saved and which had to be abandoned. Casualties needed processing, investigations needed to be started, and the political fallout from his unconventional tactics had to be managed. His diplomatic team suddenly had to defend coalition actions to a simulated galactic community horrified by the suicide ship tactics. Some species called for to face war crimes tribunals. Others praised the victory, but questioned the methods. The simulation showed how military victory could become political disaster if not properly managed. When the 72 simulated hours finally ended, the cadets were physically and emotionally exhausted. 3 days of constant decision-making, crisis management, and moral ambiguity had pushed them to their limits. Several cadets had made decisions they regretted. Others had frozen at critical moments, their hesitation leading to simulated deaths that could have been prevented. Instructor gathered them for the final debrief. She looked at each of them carefully, noting the exhaustion and the new hardness in their expressions. They'd lost something during the simulation, some innocence or certainty that could never be fully recovered. "How many of you would make the same choices again?" she asked. About half the hands went up, including S. The other half hesitated or remained down. "Good," said. "That uncertainty is appropriate. Command means making choices without perfect information, living with consequences you can't undo, and never being completely sure you did the right thing. Anyone who's certain they made only correct decisions during that simulation either isn't being honest with themselves or didn't understand the complexity of what they were doing." She pulled up statistical analysis of their performance. Fleet losses, civilian casualties, economic damage, political fallout. The numbers were sobering. Even the successful strategies had significant costs. "You won the military engagement," told command team. "But you nearly lost the political war. Using suicide tactics saved lives in the short term but damaged coalition credibility in the long term. That's the kind of trade-off real commanders face. No perfect solutions, only least bad options." She turned to diplomatic team. "You maintained ethical high ground throughout the crisis, which is commendable. But your insistence on following proper protocols meant the enemy controlled the pace of events until military force became inevitable. Sometimes diplomacy needs to be more aggressive, more willing to call out bad faith negotiations before they waste critical time." For the next 2 hours, she methodically reviewed every major decision, every turning point in the simulation. She didn't tell them what they should have done differently. Instead, she highlighted the trade-offs each choice created and asked them to consider whether the costs were justified by the results. "There's no answer key for command," she finally said. "No perfect strategy that works every time. The best commanders are the ones who understand consequences, who think several moves ahead, and who can live with the weight of their decisions. You've all developed those capabilities over the past 6 months. Some of you will become exceptional military leaders. Others will take this knowledge into diplomacy, intelligence work, or civilian leadership. But all of you now understand what real conflict means and what it costs." She paused and for the first time saw something like pride in her expression. "When I started training you, you were talented cadets with theoretical knowledge and untested assumptions. Now you're warriors who understand both the capability and the cost of warfare. You know how to fight like devils and choose to fight with honor. That combination makes you exactly what the coalition needs." The formal training concluded with ceremony and documentation. The cadets received their completion certificates and assignments to their next postings. Some were heading to active duty positions, others to staff roles, diplomatic services, or advanced training in specific specialties. On the final evening, before they all dispersed to different parts of coalition space, the cadets gathered one last time in the observation deck. The brown dwarf cast its amber light across their diverse forms, species from across the galaxy brought together by shared experience. "I hated this at first," admitted his translator, conveying complex emotions. "Everything taught us seemed wrong against everything I believed about honorable service. But now I understand. She wasn't teaching us to abandon honor. She was teaching us to protect it by understanding what threatens it." "I'm scared," Mora confessed, her crystalline body flickering with uncertain colors. "Scared that I learned these lessons too well, that I'll use them when I shouldn't because they're effective, that I'll become something I don't want to be." Understood completely. The same fear lived in him, the worry that knowledge of darkness might make it easier to choose darkness. "That's why we need to stay connected," he said. "Remember each other, remember these conversations. Hold each other accountable to the values we came here with, even while using the skills we learned here." They made a pact that night, all 23 cadets. They would check in regularly, share their experiences, and remind each other of both the capability and the restraint they'd learned. They would be each other's conscience, preventing any one of them from sliding too far into the darkness had shown them. Instructor found them there on her final rounds of the station before the next training group arrived. She didn't say anything at first, just stood with them, looking out at the stars. "Do you think we'll ever actually need this?" finally asked her. "Is there really something out there that will force us to fight the way you taught us?" Was quiet for a long moment. "I hope not. I genuinely, desperately hope that you spend long careers in peaceful service and retire having never fired a shot in anger. That would mean I taught you skills you never needed, which would be the best possible outcome." She turned to look at them. "But hope is not a strategy. Preparation is. And if the day comes when you face something that threatens everything the Coalition stands for, something that won't stop until it's destroyed or it destroys you, I want you to have every possible advantage. I want you to survive. I want the civilization you protect to survive. And if that means carrying uncomfortable knowledge and difficult capabilities, then that's a burden worth bearing." Looked around at his companions, at the family they'd become through shared adversity. Different species, different cultures, different values in many ways, but united by understanding that peace required preparation, that civilization required protection, and that sometimes the guardians of civilization needed to understand its alternatives. "Thank you, instructor," he said, speaking for all of them, "for showing us the darkness so we could better appreciate the light, for teaching us to fight so we could better understand peace, for making us warriors who choose not to be." Smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. "You're welcome, cadet. Now go forth and use that knowledge wisely. Make me proud not by how well you fight, but by how rarely you need to." The next morning, they departed. 23 cadets spreading across Coalition space, carrying with them knowledge that most of their species had never needed. Some would become legends in Coalition military service. Others would prevent wars through diplomatic brilliance informed by understanding of alternatives. A few would struggle with what they'd learned, needing support to integrate their new capabilities with their old values. But all of them would remember Training Station 17 and the human instructor who taught them that civilization's greatest strength was not innocence, but the conscious choice of restraint from a position of terrible capability. They had learned war from humanity, but more importantly, they had learned why humanity had chosen peace. Looked back at the station one final time as his transport pulled away. Instructor stood at an observation window, watching them leave. He raised one hand in salute, and she returned the gesture. A moment of understanding between teacher and student, between species that had traveled very different paths to reach similar conclusions about the nature of civilization and the price of its defense. The transport jumped to faster-than-light travel, and Training Station 17 vanished into the distance. But its lessons would remain with them forever, shaping how they served, how they led, and how they chose to use or not use the knowledge they'd gained. They were aliens who had learned human warfare, but more importantly, they were civilized beings who had learned to consciously choose civilization even when other options were available. That ultimately was Instructor's true lesson. Not how to fight without rules, but why rules mattered enough to defend them with every capability, conventional or otherwise, that civilization could muster. They had come to learn control and left understanding war. It was a heavy knowledge to carry, but they would carry it together, as humanity had before them, as guardians should. As they stood together watching the stars, felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was heavy but not unbearable. Shared among his companions, distributed across species and philosophies and individual choices, it became manageable. They were learning not just to fight, but to carry the burden of being able to fight. That second skill had taught them was just as important as the first with exhaustion, and his mind churned with new understanding. He was beginning to comprehend just how gentle coalition warfare had been, how much restraint both sides had shown in every conflict. And he was beginning to understand why humanity both treasured and feared its own military history. It was, realized, a terrible responsibility, but someone had to bear it. Someone had to be willing to look into the darkness and come back to tell others what they'd seen. That was the real lesson was teaching, not just tactics and strategies, but the psychological cost of being truly prepared for the worst. Returning to that simulation, to those human ships diving straight into destruction to achieve their objective. It was so alien to everything he'd been taught, so contrary to the careful, calculated warfare the Coalition practiced. But it had worked. That was the terrifying part. It had worked.